think it's time for you to have your lysergic acid. Drink this down and... Mojo Radio. Mojo Radio. We love...
Hello everyone, welcome back to Rec Room Radio. Today we have our guest with us, Lewis Ungit, is how you say your last name, sir?
Right, yep.
And we are discussing his book that he has published, The Return of the Dragon. He is the author of this book that covers the use of psychedelics and interdimensional beings, and he discusses more in depth of the harmful effects or uses of psychedelics and what it has on the mind and consciousness. Today we're going to be discussing his novel and going into detail about it. A link would also be applied below when we post of his novel for anyone interested in purchasing. Hazy, you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Yeah, it's sorry for that. Just a little malfunction on my side. Hello, as usual, it's Hazy Dialects, your favorite constant profile changer. Kitsoesi is an avid Twitter user and the co-host of Requiem Radio, who's here with our guest, who is a bit of working in tandem with our previous guest a while back ago, Marcel, who discussed extensively about psychedelics, and I think it's very interesting to have both perspectives about the particular topics. And since Solar is so exceptional at finding guests and knowing where to look, we found ourselves not only with somebody who does have strong opinions about psychedelics, but has done extensive research for the purposes of not only divulging that information to the public at large, but has written a book about it. For that, I would like to have our guest talk a little bit about himself and just the book in general. Nice to have you on, and I'll leave the floor to you.
Thanks so much for having me on. Yeah, so like you said, my name is Lewis Ungit, and I'm an author that writes on a lot of different subjects. I have a Substack, Lewis Ungit, at .substack.com, that you can check out kind of my writings. But this book in particular has been I published it about a year ago, and it has been, some of the bestseller lists, and it's been very successful and kind of reached a lot of important people that really appreciated the work. And I think it's very relevant for today because in the Western world, psychedelics has become kind of the in thing again, the popular thing. So basically what this book seeks to do is to find out what is going on with psychedelics, to look at what the history of it is, look at how we should view them, whether we should be accepting of them or whether we should reject them, and kind of engage as them, looking at all of that put together. My personal background is I've got degrees in philosophy and theology, a degree in science, and a degree in non-related but business. And also I just read pretty voraciously. So I started doing research on this book a couple of years ago, and really dove deep into it, read everything I could find. I looked at all the scientific studies. A lot of those are super interesting, just reading those without commentary. Johns Hopkins has done a lot of work on them, and as well as University of Wisconsin Madison, New York University, etc. So did a lot of work on that, and just tried to integrate my very multi-disciplinary background and tried to bring it all together to bring a coherent picture of what psychedelics are. And my overall, just full disclosure, my overall takeaway is they're probably not something we should be messing around with, and there's probably a reason why they were taboo in Western society. So not a positive view of them in the end, but I tried to give them a fair shake in the book as I went through some of the studies.
And why did you name it The Return of the Dragon? Out of curiosity, the title.
Yeah, so it's kind of a prevalent theme throughout the book, where I just looking, as I mentioned, some of the philosophy and theology behind it. There's always these myths of serpents throughout history. There's a book called The Serpent Symbol in the Ancient Near East by a professor at Yale, who, by the name of Leslie Wilson, and he wrote about the serpent symbol and how all these ancient societies all worshipped a serpent deity. And that's something that obviously you also see in a lot of other societies, like the Mesoamericans. The Aztecs, for example, worshipped a feathered serpent, Quetzalcoatl, and as well as a bunch of other serpent deities. So there's this kind of ancient idea of the serpent. And then one of the interesting things that you find over and over again within people that take psychedelics today is that they say they interact with a serpent deity or a serpent entity. Graham Hancock, who's best-selling author, wrote America Before, as well as some other best-selling books. He talks about how the fact that when he takes ayahuasca, he's a big proponent of ayahuasca. He talks about when he takes ayahuasca, he often interacts with a serpent human hybrid that he calls Mother Ayahuasca. And he said this is something that almost everybody that takes ayahuasca sees. So kind of the Return of the Dragon is a reference to that, of there's these ancient dragons that people interacted with, and now we're kind of resurrecting those with the use of psychedelics. And just for me, that was a striking parallel that we see between the ancient world and today.
Yeah, I also liked how in your chapter 1, Pandora's Box, you were talking about Zeus giving Pandora a box and warning her never to open it. And then you go into more detail of like other myths and traditions and stories, even the serpent in the Garden of Eden in the Book of Genesis. And I find very interesting parallels. You see it as a universal thing amongst different cultures and beliefs.
Yeah, it is amazingly, once you start looking into it, it's amazing how consistent it is in history. I mean, just every society almost has some sort of serpent deity, including the ancient Greeks, including the ancient Romans, including the Vikings. I mean, you just go around the world and everybody had some kind of serpent deity that they worshipped.
All right, last thing, and I'm going to pass it over to Hazy. But what inspired you to write this novel?
Yeah, well, just to be clear, it's not a novel; it's a non-fiction book. Hopefully, no problem. But yeah, what inspired me was really just kind of the zeitgeist that's around right now around psychedelics, where you have people like Joe Rogan, who's obviously wildly popular podcaster that just promotes psychedelics all the time on his show, talks about ayahuasca. And then you have people like Aaron Rodgers, the football player, that talks about he had like a born-again experience, not a Christian one, but a non-Christian born-again experience with ayahuasca, where he said he felt like he was born the first time after he did ayahuasca. You have other social commentators kind of promoting their use, including guys like Scott Adams. Conservative people you wouldn't even think would be into psychedelics all of a sudden are into psychedelics. I found that interesting. And then in addition to that, as I started to research ayahuasca and DMT, by the way, I'm going to use ayahuasca and DMT somewhat interchangeably. Dimethyltryptamine is the active ingredient in ayahuasca, and they've been able to isolate that and create a chemical version of it called DMT. So anyway, if I interchange those, it's not because it's just easy to interchange those. But basically, the use of DMT, which didn't even exist. Well, it existed obviously historically, but wasn't at all kind of in the hippie culture, is now widespread and being used more and more by just normal people. There's magazine articles written on it, etc. And I started to look into what happens when you take DMT. And I don't know if you guys have looked into it, but it's super interesting. It's amazingly consistent visions that people have. They see these geometric shapes that look kind of like Aztec step drawings. If you guys can picture kind of Aztec art, that's what it looks like that people see. They consistently see entities that they interact with. They if you've heard machine elves, they'll see machine elves. They'll see serpents, like I mentioned earlier, and I just found that incredibly interesting. Like, people are all doing this drug and they're all seeing the same things. I was just fascinated, like, what is going on? And that's really what drove me down this rabbit hole of doing the research on it, studying reading the studies and looking into what we know about it scientifically. And then also, like I said, I think my book kind of takes a turn midway through and starts looking at the philosophy and theology of it as well.
Hazy, you want to add anything with that?
It's interesting. Mostly, that's usually my question I usually ask for our guests who come on is what innately got you into the particular topic or subject matter, and what like inspired a deep dive. And I suppose with that question being answered, one of the interesting facets of psychedelics in terms of its discourse, I think, since no one's really asked this question, who do you think, in terms of the political spectrum you've seen, the large array of individuals speaking about it, who do you think has had the most sensible or responsible discussion of it? Like the one out of the ones that's voting.
In terms of who has had the kind of the best take on it, the most responsible view on it, I don't know. That's actually a hard thing. In some ways, that's why I wrote my book, is like I felt like you either have people that are big proponents of it, guys like Joe Rogan, Graham Hancock, etc., or you have guys that are almost, it seems like, hardcore against it, but not necessarily for great reasons. And often religious or just culturally conservative people that are against it, which are great, but not necessarily for the reasons that I at least would agree with on that. And so I thought it was worth. That's really why I wrote the book, was because I think it was an empty space. I don't know that there's a great person that I agree with. It's funny. I'm in the end, I'm anti-psychedelics in the book, but in a lot of ways, I agree with a lot of the pro-drug people on a lot of things that they're saying. In that, I agree with Graham Hancock, for example, when he and we talked about this a little bit earlier before the show started, but when he started discussing the fact that he does not believe that this is just a scrambling of the brain. He believes this is a retuning of the brain to see something real. So it's not, we're all kind of like, in America, even religious people tend to be materialistic in our view of the world. And so we take this physical drug, it does something physical to our brain, and we just assume that the result is a physical result, and we have some kind of brain malfunction. We see colors and think that we're talking to things, and we sober up and we realize that it was all kind of like a dream or whatever, but it wasn't real. And what Graham Hancock says is he doesn't think that's true. And I agree 100% with him on that. Like, I think that there's something more going on, something much more interesting than just brain chemistry going on. And so in some ways I would say read Graham Hancock, except for he's so pro psychedelic that I can't just tell people to go read Graham Hancock, because I disagree with the use of them. I think we have to be a lot more cautious about what exactly we're bumping into.
And it's funny you mention that too, because even our prior guest, who I'm sure you guys are black and white in a lot of your views, he's also in the position to be like, hey, it's really strange that people like Aaron Rodgers, these guys are promoting psychedelics among, like right-wing conservatives. And he's saying like he is strongly against the use of psychedelics. He feels like it's a very bad thing to do. So I find that very interesting.
Yeah, and I think I know who you're talking about, and I've interacted with him as well. His reasons for being against it are largely, I think, because a lot of the roots of it are from the intelligence community. A lot of the reasons why psychedelics kind of came onto the scene in the 1950s, 60s, were largely out of government institutions and government efforts. I'm sure you guys have heard of MK Ultra. I'm sure you guys have heard of some of the projects that the CIA has done on mind control, etc. And I would agree with him in many ways on that, but I think that it's actually more complicated than that. I think the reason the CIA actually got into psychedelics initially had to do with a lot more than just mind control, and we can talk about that in more depth if you guys want.
Yeah, we could talk that down the road. First, we just need to cover more of your book. You're okay if us going through some of the chapters or things that I found interesting?
Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
Would you want to give us a brief elaboration more for Pandora's Box? You kind of set the scene, you showed the myths. Do you want to talk about more reemergence? Is that going into detail of what we discussed earlier? Hey, there's people, going around promoting this again?
Yeah, that's exactly kind of what that chapter is about. It's about just a lot of what we already covered, but just the fact that it's become pretty much mainstream now. I don't know if you guys listen to the Boyscast podcast, but Danny Polachek was talking about going to a party, and he said people are just handing mushrooms around, and he said something along the lines of mushrooms are just in right now. And that's a wild thing to be in kind of the conservative space. Not that Boy Scouts is necessarily conservative, but they're definitely not hippies, right? And for normal kind of straight-laced people to be passing around mushrooms at parties is crazy, right? It's a wild thing. So yeah, that chapter is mostly just talking about how incredibly mainstream it's become just in the last 20 years, maybe, not even that, just the last 10, 15 years is become incredibly mainstream. And then I don't know if you want to go to the next chapter, but
yeah, I'd love to do that. Sorry about that. I was having a bit of an issue.
Yeah, that's all right. So the next chapter is experiences. And in that chapter, I really just go into kind of the science of it. So I talk about what exactly people experience when they do psychedelics. So I went through a variety of different aspects to what people typically have. I talk about the fact that people almost always have some kind of spiritual experience. And so they say, hey, I found God, I met angels, or I had some kind of profound insight into the human condition. They'll often come back with moral lessons. They'll say things like, all these differences between us are bad, and we just need to all live as one. Or they'll say things like, I lost my sense of self, and I just started to unite with the universe. And so you get kind of religious experiences that people have. Michael Pollan, who wrote a book called How to Change Your Mind, he goes through a lot of the science. It's actually a very good book in that sense, except for, once again, it's pretty pro-psychedelic, so I can't just blindly recommend it. But Michael Pollan said the following. Here's a quote. He said, "You go deep enough or far out enough in consciousness, and you will bump into the sacred. It's not something that we generate. It's something that's out there waiting to be discovered. And this reliably happens to non-believers as well as believers." So I found that interesting, is that one of the experiences that people have when they do psychedelics, whether or not they're religious, is religious experiences. And that's been repeated by study after study that people have stated that they have religious experiences. Another thing people consistently experience when they take psychedelic drugs, especially DMT and ayahuasca, as I mentioned earlier, is geometric shapes. Dr. Rick Strassman, a professor of psychiatry at the University of New Mexico School of Medicine, he led a giant study on DMT, and goes through kind of all the experiences, and this is one of the ones that he says is amazingly consistent, that people see these zigzag shapes, they see kaleidoscope-like colors, and how consistently it looks like kind of Mesoamerican art. If you kind of listen to what people say, it's like another consistent experience that they have. Another thing this is more limited to DMT, although it's definitely true on other psychedelics, like LSD, psilocybin. Psilocybin's the chemical active ingredient within magic mushrooms. But at least on DMT and ayahuasca are kind of like the super version of psychedelics. You can get the same experiences that you get on ayahuasca or DMT if you take a ton of LSD or a ton of psilocybin, but it's DMT and ayahuasca are by far the most potent psychedelics you can take. And one of the things that they've found when they give people DMT is they consistently see these entities. This, again, it comes from Dr. Strassman's study, but he said that of the participants in his study, 90% experience entities. And there's just all these very common experiences that they have. And this is true. The crazy thing about seeing these entities is it's true whether you're a indigenous person from Brazil taking ayahuasca, or if you're a hippie from Australia taking ayahuasca, or if you're a businessman in California taking ayahuasca. Almost everybody sees very similar entities. And Dr. Strassman talks about the fact that it's just uncanny, the similarities. David Luke, who's a professor at University of Greenwich, says, here's a quote from him. He says, "There's uncanny commonalities at the core of the experiences emanating from old folklore accounts of fairies, anthropological, and indeed firsthand accounts of indigenous cultures, as well as from FDA-approved experimental research." So he talks about the fact that you almost are like seeing these mythical entities every time you take these DMT trips. And so that's just another fascinating thing. The other interesting thing about these entities that people see, and this is very relevant to my point, is that when people come down, so like when you guys dream, when you guys take a nap or whatever, you have a dream, you'll see people, you'll see things, you'll see entities, but then you wake up and you say, okay, that was all a dream. But when people take DMT, they come down, and a large majority of them say that was real. They say those entities were actually real entities, and they're still in existence. I just can't see them anymore. And so over and over again, people will testify that they were real. And I go through in my book, I talk about some of these accounts. When I was doing the research for this book, there's websites that will just have people's DMT stories, and I just went through a bunch of them. They're incredibly fascinating, what people see and what people interact with when they go through those. Another thing I talk about in that chapter is the fact that there's this giant overlap between the psychedelic experience and some natural experiences. So if you think about a mystical experience, whether it's like a yogi in Hindu yogi or a Buddhist monk or whatever that has a mystical experience, a lot of the reports that people have, a lot of the things that mystics report are very similar to what you see on DMT. And it is interesting. There's been a lot of studies. The Journal of Neuroscience, for example, did a study talking about how the use of meditation or yoga or rhythmic drumming or rhythmic dancing can actually have endogenous self-induced high that you get from it that gives you very similar state to what you get from the psychedelic experience. So that's another very interesting thing about the psychedelic experience.
Is that similar to being almost like in a flow state where you have like a background like rhythm and you're just like doing your thing, or you're like really locked in your work? Because I know psychology talks about like humans, if you get really focused or hyper focused into one thing, your efficiency becomes better, and they call it like flow state, basically. Would that be a similar comparison?
I mean, that there may be some similarities there, but that's not what these studies are talking about. These studies are talking about all kind of the things I talked about, the geometric shapes, the seeing entities, the ability to, when people take DMT, for example, and I haven't talked about this part, the ability to kind of leave your body and look at yourself from the outside. Those things you can reproduce using kind of the religious tricks, especially of the East, of Eastern religions. You're able to reproduce a lot of those states naturally without the use of drugs. And in many ways, you could argue that's kind of what some of those religions are for. That's what they're built to do, is to reproduce that effect and that feeling. And then finally, one of the things that's pointed out over and over again is that not only is it you can reproduce it yourself naturally, but also people naturally that have mental issues, people that have schizophrenia or people that have real bad bipolar, often will say they experience the same things. And this is William Richards, who he's a professor. I can't remember where he teaches, but he's one of the researchers that I quote here. He says the following. He says, mental health professionals know well that similar experiences to those of healthy people on psychedelics, usually called hallucinations, are reported by distressed people who we often give the diagnosis of schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. So the amazing feelings, the visions, the insights that people report having while on hallucinogens aren't just found through the drugs, right? So they're found in a variety of different natural states that people have. And so it's an interesting overlap. Now, one of the crazy things that you see in these studies is that people talk about having out-of-body experiences. One of the more shocking claims made by a lot of these users is that they can exit their body and see their body from the outside. And there's reports of people actually being able to observe things they wouldn't otherwise be able to observe. There's also a telepathic element to this, where people that they'll take the drug together and they'll report that they were able to have a conversation without talking, just a telepathic conversation back and forth with each other, to the point where a lot of people didn't even want to do it again because it felt like a lack of privacy, like someone was able to get inside their brain. 40% of the people in one of these studies reported having some sort of telepathic experience, which is just wild. It's crazy. DMT actually, or ayahuasca, when it was first discovered, one of the names that it was given was telepathine for that reason, because people felt like they could become telepaths. So anyway, I've gone through a lot there. I don't know if you guys have any questions at that point. There's a few other things I cover in that chapter, but do you guys have any questions on what I've talked about so far?
Yeah, Hazy, you want to ask anything?
All right, I have myself muted because sometimes there's a bit of an audio issue that sometimes arises. So it seems like to me that what the book is discussing happens to be this notion of a spiritual awakening or a spiritual experience being a consequence of consuming psychedelics. And that often makes me interested in the notion of, sure, this experience is occurring, and that is possibly like just the sensations, but could knowledge and information about where you are or where you're at in culture be the thing that informs what images that like transpire, like what during the experience in of itself. Would you believe it's reasonable to say that like where they are or what culture they are familiar with does inform the experience?
Yeah, I kind of touched on that earlier. So there are elements that are culturally influenced, but what is interesting about ayahuasca and DMT is how much is not culturally influenced. It's interesting how consistent it is across cultures, actually. And like I mentioned, I think it was David Luke, who's a researcher. I think he's at Duke, but he mentioned how it was uncanny how much was independent of culture. So certainly there are some experiences that are culturally influenced, but it's amazing how much is not culturally influenced.
And do you think that this like existence of like a cultural similarity that at the very least some of these researchers can't exactly find sufficient answers for is proof of like a more like religious experience, if anything, or a spiritual experience, like a true one?
Well, so I want to be careful here because the way I write this book is I don't think it's good to just say spiritual versus is it spiritual or is it non-spiritual without defining what we mean by spiritual. So I think what I've talked about so far is not whether or not the spiritual experience is real or what spiritual is, but just the fact that people report the spiritual experience. That's a fact, right? So people, whether they're religious or not, they report having spiritual experiences. You could say that's brain chemistry. It's not actually a spiritual experience, but they report a spiritual experience. So I think that's what I've talked about so far. So so far in our conversation here, I have not made the case that it was a real experience. I'm just saying that's what people say.
We're not jumping to the positive or negative of it. I'm not jumping to like whether or not it's an related case. But I was more or less just entertaining it. Like I suppose the big question is, what do you think? Or if you would have to speculate, what do you think it's causing that reoccurrence to transpire? External of like societal norms or cultural iconography.
Right. So let's talk for a second about the materialistic explanations, because you're right. It's not like every scientist that studies this becomes religious or ceases to be materialist. As a matter of fact, I would say most probably don't. But so science has done a lot of work to try and understand materialistic explanations for this. Understandably, that's kind of how modern science is materialistic by default, right? So that's what they try to find. So in How to Change Your Mind by Michael Pollan, he talks about the science in depth. He has a whole chapter on it, and he talks about all the they'll do to have the person take the drug, like lysergic acid, diethylamine, which is LSD, or psilocybin, and then they'll study the workings of the brain. And he says the following. He says the mystical experience may just be what it feels like to deactivate your brain's default mode network. He says this can be achieved a number of ways, through psychedelics or meditation, but perhaps also by means of certain breathing exercises, sensory deprivation, fasting, prayer, overwhelming experiences, awe, extreme sports, near-death experiences, so on. So basically, to boil it down, most materialistic explanations are that. They say that it's something about the drug deactivates your brain's default mode network. So basically, it says that your brain goes all different directions. The neural patterns kind of reset, and that's the materialistic explanation. Now, however, I don't find that to be a good explanation. And here's what I said in the book. I said, whatever insights that neuroscience might give us about what's going on in the brain, it's important to realize that observation of changes in the brain are not actually an explanation of what is being seen or experienced. Stating that deactivating our brain's neural network or default mode network causes the mystical experience is not much more explanatory than saying I took magic mushrooms and that caused a mystical experience, right? It's saying there's a physical phenomenon, and then there was an experience associated with that physical phenomenon. It explains basically a mechanism But it doesn't necessarily speak to whether the experience itself is true or not, right? It doesn't speak to whether or not your experiences are in any way talking or interacting with something that's real. To give the example I gave to show why that isn't true is, imagine the entire world was deaf, like we all had an ear problem, and therefore all of us lived in silence, and we had developed sign language, etc., to communicate. And then imagine that someone from another planet came and did surgery on one of our ears, or put drops in our ears or whatever, and all of a sudden one person, only one person, nobody else, said that they could hear things. They said when a bird opened its mouth, it could hear, the person could hear a chirp. When the dog opened its mouth, they could hear a bark. When a glass fell off the table, they could hear it break. And then the eardrops wear off and they go back to normal. And everyone that observed the eardrop, the procedure on the ears, they all say, well, it's weird that his thinking got all messed up there. Obviously some damage was done to his head when they dropped those eardrops in there. He thought he could experience some other experience that happened with ears. We figured out the mechanism behind it, and therefore we know that he wasn't really hearing anything because we know the mechanism. Now, obviously, that's a ridiculous example, but in some ways it shows exactly what I'm talking about, where if by modifying the default mode network of your brain, you are able to see into another dimension. If by modifying the brain in some way, you're able to see or experience things that everybody else isn't able to experience, that doesn't tell you anything about whether those things are real or not. It doesn't tell you anything about whether or not the things that you are interacting with are actual things or not. It just tells you the mechanism. And so I think it's very important to know that pointing to a mechanism doesn't give insight about the reality of what the mechanism reveals. And you could think about that with any sense that we have, is that you can modify us to do more. You can modify people do take drugs that make them be able to feel more, for example. It doesn't mean the stuff that they feel isn't real. It just makes it so that they are super sensitive to touch or whatever.
I like that response, especially when it comes to materialism, because materialism, although it is very good, and pragmatism has its flaws in the sense that it denies all things that are external. So to be a quote-unquote pure materialist, you'd have to even deny concepts like, love or things like that. You'd say love doesn't exist. It's simply chemical compounds making you want to reproduce, which like other people believe, like, hey, there may be a deeper meaning than just chemicals and compounds.
Yeah, exactly. And the other problem with a lot of this discussion when it comes to consciousness is the fact that even the most atheist people in the world admit that consciousness is unobservable. So if you think about when I say, I feel, this is what it feels like to be Lewis. And kind of right now I feel fine. Another time I might feel tired. Another time I might feel hungry. This is what it feels like to be Lewis. And that's my consciousness. Consciousness is actually unobservable by science. Sam Harris's wife, the famous atheist Sam Harris, his wife, Annika Harris, wrote an interesting book. I think it's called On Consciousness. She also is an atheist, but she talks about the fact that science can't see consciousness. It can see phenomenon that it associates with consciousness, but it can't see the consciousness itself. And the example she gave to show that is, let's imagine you created a robot with artificial intelligence built into it, and it was able to respond in a way that looked like it was conscious. Let's say it could laugh when you told a joke. It would cry when you looked like you were sad. It knew to raise its eyebrows if you said something interesting, or frown when you said something rude. It could do all of the things that we associate with consciousness, and we could scan its circuitry, and we could see the various circuits going off when those supposed emotions are taking place. But it wouldn't be conscious. You know, it'd just be a robot that we built. There's no reason to believe it's conscious any more than AI is conscious. We know the ones and zeros behind it, so it wouldn't be conscious. And yet, all the things that we associate with consciousness, it would be doing. And in the same way, humans, we do the same thing. We raise our eyebrows when something's interesting. We laugh when something's funny. We cry when something's sad. And you can scan us to see what's going on when we do that. But there's no evidence that we're looking at consciousness with those scans, right? We're looking at all the mechanisms that go into our behaviors. But the consciousness itself is completely invisible to science. And that's something that actually more thoughtful atheists acknowledge. It's called the hard problem of consciousness. Steven Pinker, famous Harvard atheist, talks about that. Richard Dawkins, obviously giant famous atheist, talks about that. Sam Harris has talked about that in depth. So consciousness is actually unobservable. So when people say, oh, we found the mechanism that tells us that the experience, the altered consciousness you have on drugs is false because we know the mechanism behind it, they're really speaking to something that they don't know about. They don't realize, they don't know about the hard problem of consciousness, because they wouldn't be able to say that if they truly understood the challenges with observing consciousness. You can't. So that's like this fatal flaw to this whole discussion when people try and come up with naturalistic explanations or materialistic explanations for these things. Now, with that being said, I think maybe it might be good to kind of go to the next chapter, because I think the next chapter is maybe an important chapter when it comes to talking about spiritual versus material and what we're talking about there. Because I think a lot of people use the word spiritual and they don't know what it means. And, you know, we just have a sense, I think for most people, it just means something not real or something that is like imaginary. Even Christians, I think for a lot of people, they don't quite understand it and they don't think about it. So I tried to put it in a few different ways in my chapter 4, Dimensions. So I don't know if you guys want to talk about that, but I can kind of talk about what my premise there was.
Yeah, real quick, let's get Hazy, because I know he has a question to ask you real quick.
Okay, go ahead, Hazy.
Is Hazy speaking right now?
I can't hear him.
Hazy, you there, man?
I'm here. You hear me?
Yep, go ahead.
Okay. I had a question earlier about the topic of consciousness, I believe, but it kind of escapes me a bit right now. But I think we can just move on to the next topic about the subject matter. It's fine.
Yeah.
We'll return later.
No problem. And by the way, don't ever, feel free to interrupt anytime. I'm not offended at all. So I'm going down these long rants, but
no. So I was asking a question. So it wasn't even you. It was just so I was asking a question, and I wanted to let that engagement transpire before I asked my question, but I lost it. That was entirely on me. So we can move on to the next part of the conversation.
Okay, sounds good. So we kind of all have this 3-dimensional experience, right? Or 4 if you count time. We all live in a world where we can observe, we can feel, we can touch everything. And that's kind of the whole premise of science, is that we live in 3 dimensions. But one of the interesting things about quantum theory that's just come to light in the last 100 years or so is the idea that there's not just 3 dimensions. There's up to 10 dimensions that there are. And those dimensions potentially, typically guys like Stephen Hawking will refer to those as small, but what he means by small is they're small from our perspective. The analogy he used was a straw. So if you imagine looking down add a straw just at the tip of it, it would seem really small. But if you turned it sideways, it could be 5 feet long, right? Because it's just from your perspective, it looks small. So the dimensions aren't really small. So there's this idea of multiple dimensions that a lot of scientists have looked at, and like I said, Stephen Hawking talks about that. But like other scientists, like astrophysicist Paul Sutter, talks about the fact that these dimensions potentially could be the explanation for dark matter. I don't know if you guys are aware of dark matter, but it's the idea that 80% of the universe's mass is invisible to us. And it could be, in theory, explained by forces and matter being present in other dimensions. And of course, that's like fairly new research and highly speculative. But I just found it interesting as I was researching this book that there's this idea of multiple dimensions within kind of atheistic materialism, right? There's this idea that there might be all these things and all this matter out there that we can't see, or at least not from our perspective can we see it. So the possibility of a fourth or more spatial dimensions that may contain entities is something that is certainly not outside of the realm of science. This overlap between kind of this atheist materialist view of multiple dimensions and kind of philosophical Christian theological religious views of multiple dimensions is an interesting overlap where the idea of if you look at dimensions when it comes to Christianity, for example, N.T. Wright, when he talks about heaven, he says the following. He says, N.T. Wright, by the way, is an Oxford New Testament scholar, but he says the biblical understanding of heaven must be described in terms of dimension. Heaven in the Bible, this is a quote, is not a future destiny, but the other hidden dimension of our ordinary life, God's dimension, if you like. And so I think rather than talking about spiritual versus materialistic, and this is why I talked about the fact that I wrote my book kind of so even a materialistic atheist could agree with the premise. But rather than talking about spiritual versus non-spiritual, which brings up all kinds of baggage with it in a lot of ways for people that are not religious, I think it might be more helpful just to talk about this as a dimension. Is it possible that psychedelics bring you into another dimension? As a religious person, you might say that's the spiritual dimension. If you're atheist, you might just say, hey, it's another dimension, a quantum dimension. But I think that it might be a more helpful way to look at some of these things rather than it immediately putting everybody's guard up with, is this a religious argument? Or is this a quiet way to try and get me to become a Christian or a Hindu or whatever? And instead, let's just stay atheist if you want to stay atheist, and let's just look at it like a dimension. So that's kind of the point of chapter 4 is let's leave the title, and we can, depending on your religious background, you can call it whatever you want, but let's leave that title off and let's just talk about it as an alternate dimension. And then the question is, do these psychedelics, is it possible that these psychedelics are, as Graham Hancock argues, tuning you into a different dimension or allowing you...
Oh, like, is it granting you access to it? Oh, my bad, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it seems like we're discussing whether or not, like, these psychedelics are providing you a gateway and access to that ability to get into that dimension, which is like a theory that's been birthed out in recent years.
Yes, yeah, that's exactly the idea is like whether it's possible that there's many other dimensions around us and that for whatever reason our brain can't see them unless we modify our brain, right? So our brain allows us to see those other dimensions in some way, and that potentially that's what's going on when we take psychedelics.
In terms of so this portion of the book is basically discussing basically just conceptually like getting there, or is it just basically like laying out the groundwork for just like, all right, this is like conceptually what they think this is the domain of. Now we're going to get into the legitimacy of whether or not it can or cannot get there. Because I remember you said earlier in the conversation about not that you being apprehensive about that being the case, and I imagine that the rest of the chapters get into. But
yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Okay, go.
Yeah, so that's, I mean, that ultimately that is, these first few chapters are laying the groundwork for it, right? So they're laying the groundwork for the possibility that something real is going on. Now, if you want to know kind of what the case I'm making that something real is going on, I can tell you that. I can't remember exactly where in the book this is, so I'll just, maybe this might be a good time to jump forward to why I think something real is going on. Is I think that, first of all, as I mentioned with consciousness, to try and observe it is impossible. Science can't see it. So how can we know about consciousness? The only way we know is when people talk about it. And Sola touched on this earlier, is like, we know you love someone because they say they love you. We know you're experiencing pain because you say you're experiencing pain. We know you are you're sad because you say you're sad, right? So we can, the only way to truly know whether your experience is real is based on testimony. And
like,
of course,
like common language that's held. But even like in terms of consciousness, in terms of sleeping, in terms of rest, like anger, all these things we articulate as being like the emotions of human beings are all like similarly communicated in a way. Like it's through that like unified language of us all like talking about this, as long as we have like this unified like implicit ability to presume collective understanding as to like what these things are and how we emote them. Right. I also now remember what I was going to say earlier about materialism, about the idea of like it being chemical reactions within the brain itself. And I thought it was interesting that like, even if that is the case, like I would just say like accepting that they do acknowledge it to be as such, or would describe it as such. I don't think that's that might be a reason for some to believe it to be a negative or something to be devalued, but I don't think acknowledgement of it being in that way would behoove somebody to be like, that's not any reason for it to be invaluable or not something to be valued. It's I would say is comparable to saying that we exist in this earth for a finite amount of time isn't a reason to say that nothing that transpires within that finite amount of time doesn't matter. Something to look into that.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, and obviously that's a big discussion down a kind of a different path, and I think, you know, again, my argument from this book is not necessarily a religious argument. It's primarily focused on drugs, right, and what the drugs are doing, and it is an argument for another alternate dimension, you know, that a religious person would say is a spiritual dimension, but a materialist might just say is a quantum dimension. So yeah, I think that's true. So
hey,
Lewis, yeah, go ahead.
Would you be worried at all with people reading your book, that they could take it the wrong way, as in, you know, oh, he's talking about drugs, like show a dimension, like that'd be almost like appetizing. Do you have any chapters like going into detail, you know, why it's like you shouldn't do that then?
Yes, yeah, I do. So remember, I'm laying the groundwork right now. But let me just, I'll make the case that we're seeing real things. I'll make that case real quick, and then we can move on to the next chapter, which I think does start to talk about some of the potential downsides to it. If that makes sense to you guys. I mean, this is your show. If that's what you guys want to do, I can do that. Or if you want to go a different direction, I can do that too.
Oh, no, all good. This is your episode. You know, I enjoy just hearing you talk. So keep doing what you're doing.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so the case that makes me think these are real experiences that people are having is the following. So, like I said, the only way we know what people are experiencing from a conscious standpoint, and Sam Harris would agree with this, Steven Pinker would agree with this, atheists have to agree with this. If they understand the hard problem of consciousness, they have to agree with this, is the only way we know is when sane and honest people tell us what they experienced, right? So if someone is a liar or crazy or whatever, maybe you don't trust what they're saying. But if they're an honest person, your father, your brother, your best friend, your wife tells you what they experienced, you trust them, right? And there's no reason for them to lie. You would trust what they experienced. You trust it as real. And that's where I think we start to hear these testimonies. You start to read what people are experiencing. And I think over and over again, they say this was real. So here's the crazy thing. So in the Johns Hopkins study, they found that a majority of atheists going into the study, so these are people that were atheists before they did the study, they took DMT. They said those entities I saw were real and they continue to exist. And I'm no longer an atheist as a result. A majority of atheists did that. Overwhelming number of people, as I mentioned earlier, said those entities were real and they continue to exist. It's almost the analogy I've used is if we could go to, let's say, the dark side of the moon or whatever, and all we had to do is send a rocket ship up, and everybody goes to the dark side of the moon and they say, hey, there's little green men back there. And it's a sane and honest person. He comes back, he says, there's little green men and they're really there. And you say, well, I don't believe you. I think something crazy mentally happened to you when you went to the dark side of the moon. And then another sane and honest person comes back and they say, there was little green men there. And everybody's kind of shouting, there's little green men there. Even people that were skeptical to the little green men, at some point in time, I think you have to believe them. And I think it's to just kind of, without any sort of irrefutable proof, it's an unfalsifiable position if you don't believe them at some point in time. So when you have so many people experiencing this, saying that was a real experience, and then we just say, no, it was a brain phenomenon. And they say, no, it wasn't a brain phenomenon. I'm perfectly sober now. These are people, DMT only lasts for a few minutes. That's the chemical version of ayahuasca. Ayahuasca lasts a long time. DMT only lasts for a few minutes. So people come back down and they're perfectly sober. That's the crazy thing about DMT. You come back and you feel perfectly fine. That's why a lot of people are doing it, because it doesn't take a lot of time to experience it. And people come back and they say, I'm perfectly sane. I'm perfectly sober. And those were real. That was real stuff.
Yeah, a bit of pushback too, Lewis. What's stopping someone from saying, quote, that those weren't real atheists for these studies? What would you say to the skeptic who would respond with that?
I mean, I kind of trust that the science was done right and that they did their interviews right. I don't know why people would lie about being atheist going into the study. It was a decent size sample size. So it would be a lot of people that were lying going to the study. And I don't know, maybe, possibly, I guess, anything's possible. But ultimately, I mean, if the interesting thing about atheism, right, is that it relies on science, right? It relies on studies. It relies on the scientific process. So I think you can't, it kind of gets that whole unfalsifiable thing. You can't, once you don't like the scientific result, say, I'm going to reject that science behind the thing. So I would say if you can produce another study that shows something different, okay. Or if you can show that study was done poorly, okay. But I think right now it was done by a fairly reputable institution, and I don't think there's a good reason to doubt it. Furthermore, I'll say, just from an anecdotal standpoint, I've talked to many atheists that had that same experience that are now not atheists. So since writing this book, it's crazy because I've just had people reaching out to me on Twitter and reaching out to me via Substack and email, And the number of people that have said similar things of like, hey, I was an atheist and then I saw some stuff and I realized there was more. So the reason I tend to believe the study is that I've had lots of anecdotal accounts of people, again, that seem like sane and trustworthy people that have agreed with the results of that. So,
what would your response be to people who would say that the sensation of being on DMT or LSD, what have you, they say that like the sensation provided is what's creating God in that sphere, versus them being outside of that experience and them not continue it or not being constant? Like, would you think of the notion of them looking at the sensation that they're experiencing in that moment of time as like just simply what they're perceiving as God? Or like, would you say to that? Like, would you say to them saying, or articulating the experience as being that? The people would just isolate it and say, well, the experience itself is why they perceive it as God, rather than them coming to like some realization just by natural ongoings in their everyday.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, here's the thing. Is like I think if we want to maintain hyper skepticism, right? If we want to say, no matter what, I don't want to believe that there's another dimension there that people are seeing. I think you can, right? Like I don't think there's any proof in life for anything. I think the old philosophical statement that how do we know that I'm not a butterfly dreaming I'm a human being? You don't. Like, ultimately, if you want to be skeptical of everything, you can. But I do think that testimony from trustworthy people that have no reason to lie, and in the case of the atheists, have kind of a reason to lie in the other direction, I think we have to kind of take that testimony and to say, I, as someone that didn't take the drug, understand what they experienced better than them that took the drug, I think is presumptuous, right? I think ultimately these are sane and intelligent people that come back down and they're not brain damaged. They go back to normal afterwards, and they say that was real. I don't know how we can deny what they're telling us. It's, again, getting back to the analogy of the dark side of the moon and the little green men. I don't know how you could deny it. Especially if you yourself were to then try it and go see it, right? So that's the thing, is when people do try it, they see it. And you have people that, even people like Joe Rogan that are an avowed atheist, I think he still would call himself an atheist, but he says what he's seeing is real, right? He's said that on his show. So I think that's the interesting thing, is like, can you maintain skepticism toward it if you believe that everybody that says they saw it is wrong? I think you can. I just don't think that's the most likely way to go. And I don't think that's how, I mean, ultimately science works by observation, right? That's the whole premise of science. Descartes, for example, said, I think, therefore I am, right? That's that whole idea that I observe it. That's the core of my knowledge. And that's where I get it. That was the foundation for all science. That was the foundation for the scientific method. And if the question is this real? And you test it and you say, yes, it was real. And everybody that tests it says it's real. And it's not 100%, but it's a majority, like I said, of atheists and an overwhelming majority of all people. If you test it and you say it's real over and over again, and it's repeatable, I think that's the way kind of science works, if you want to follow science. Now, if you don't want to follow science, I've got philosophical and theological arguments in the book as well that we can go into. But I think I'm right now, up to this point, I've kind of made this argument purely with a scientific kind of social studies, etc. Path. Now, I do think there's philosophy has a lot to say about it, and I do think theology has a lot to say about it, which we can talk about. But if just from a purely materialistic standpoint, I think at the end of the day, either you trust science or you don't trust science. And if you trust science, you got to trust the science. And if you don't trust science, then we should stop being materialists or whatever and start being something else. So that's kind of my argument on that front. And like I said, I'm personally not a materialist, and I'm personally open to the idea that the scientific studies are BS, but I think if we are going to trust the scientific studies, we should trust the scientific studies, and
Yeah,
if,
and
if we're not, yeah.
I think it'd be worthwhile to like everyone to take the time upon like if you're being at the very least a true skeptic, then you should research or at least take the time to look over the research that has been provided so far by the people who are saying this is occurring. By the way, I'm not sure or not if you've mentioned any of the research about the drugs, the following drugs, but if you could, just for the sake of the audience at home, if you could tell them some of the names of some of the research you used.
I'll also be including it afterwards as well.
Okay, yeah.
You're talking about the studies I was citing?
Yeah, for the experiences of like the atheists and the ones who like
yeah, that was the Johns Hopkins study. I've got all the citations in my book, and I could email them to you later. But yeah, my book is very well cited. It's got a footnote for every study that I mentioned.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like for the people who are at home, that maybe they might want to venture in and look at those studies. But suffice it to say.
If you just Google Johns Hopkins DMT study, you should be able to find it. So, but I can, after the show, I can look for these citations and send them to you. But they're all in my book, like I said, and I'll try and get them to you. But you can just, these studies are available online, so you can just look up Johns Hopkins.
Yeah, if they're included in your book. Yeah, Lewis, if they're included in your book, there should be no issue. But for the audience, I would include, a little thing, but that's after the podcast. We could talk about that.
Yeah, totally. In terms of
you want to keep moving? Yeah, go ahead, AZ.
I was going to speak towards the like most if not all science is definitely about like if I were to take something like I am what I am, or I am thou, it's usually like the bedrock of that is like a theory of replicatability. Like if I can, like, I don't know how useful an idea or a concept is if I cannot like replicate it to you. Like if I were to go out of the way to say to you, this pencil will definitely turn the magma in about 5 minutes. You go, okay, I don't believe that to be the case, and then I consistently show you that people want to research it because it is continuously a reoccurring phenomenon that is transpiring, and most researchers like build upon like the replicatability or the ability to show that the phenomenon, whatever that might be, can indefinitely transpire with all the things to ensure that it happens the way it should have or ought to have. In terms of
ultimately is my point though. You can replicate it. Like anybody that does these drugs sees the same stuff, and they report the same thing. So if you're skeptical, you take the drug and see for yourself if it's real. And if you come back and you say actually that was real, I don't know how that doesn't meet that standard of being able to be replicated. And like Michael Pollan said, if you do it enough, sooner or later you bump into the sacred. Like that's what he said, is like this has been able to be demonstrated scientifically over and over again to non-believers as well as believers. So I think it is replicatable. I think it is something that is repeatable, and I think it is the only non-repeatable part is you can't see it unless you do it, right? That's the only non-repeatable part. But again, with the eardrops or anything else, example, dark side of the moon, etc., that it makes sense that you can't. So to say it can't be replicated without the drugs is similar to saying you can't prove there's little green men on the dark side of the moon without going to the dark side of the moon, right? So it's.
But certainly, I believe that. I believe that most of those people would probably be more skeptical in that circumstance or situation if they understood that they were not influenced when they were citing these individuals in question. It's like, okay, we can all collectively go there under the same soundness of like ability to evaluate whatever is occurring right before our eyes, versus that experience which you would have to go into it. But sure, a lot of people would go, go into experience. I felt the same things. I interpret similar things, even gods or like um, whatever like figure that came before you. It's just interesting to hear these interesting like additional like reiterations of their experiences, because looking into especially with people like Boogie 298, who has recently come out discussing his experiences on DMT and like experiencing psychedelics for himself. What seems to be recurring from some of the ones I've been looking up as of recently, because I've been kind of going down a rabbit hole of looking at psychedelics, is this continuous ego death has been a very prominent subject matter, and some of the things I looked up into. But I'm happy to like
a very, very common experience. It's one of the most common. But
so yeah, I didn't want to like bog it down entirely in this part of the conversation. We can we're well within our I think we've fleshed out extensively on this topic, so we can move on to the next one.
Cool. Yeah, and I know we were aiming for another 20 minutes here, and obviously we're through 4 chapters out of 10. And I don't want to leave anybody with the impression that I'm pro psychedelic. So I think that's one of the things. Like Marcel and I argued about this for a while when he thought I was pro psychedelic, because he's anti-psychedelic, and actually I am too. So I'll try and fast forward a little bit here. But one of the interesting things is that for the next few chapters, I just talk about kind of the philosophical and religious parallel to the kind of atheistic dimensions. So if you take the quantum physics, multiple dimensions, there's a interesting parallel with all the religious and philosophical side of things. And I talk about the theology of it and the philosophy of it. And in particular, I talk about how the fact that within philosophy, there's a difference between the lower gods, which would be like Zeus, and the pantheon of gods, and the divine. So within Plato and Aristotle, there's a divine, and then is the pantheon of gods. And I talk about how there's an interesting parallel between that and kind of Christianity, where there's God, which is the equivalent to the divine in the Aristotelian or Platonic view. And then there's the pantheon of gods, which would be in Christianity, demons and angels. And I talk about how those aren't the same things. And so when we think of like paganism and we think of the multiple gods of paganism, there is a parallel within Christianity, even though it's a monotheistic religion, which is the many entities or the many beings that are angels and demons. And so what I then go into, and here's the interesting kind of the twist in the book, is chapter 6, which is the serpent and the sacrifice. And I talk about the fact that when people take psychedelic drugs, and we talked about this earlier, they see serpents over and over again. This is so consistently seen, so everywhere. But also when people take drugs, they see serpents. And I talk about, I make the argument that because ancient religions almost always used some form of mind-altering drug, that's an interesting thing that a lot of people don't know, but I document it very well in the book, is that almost every ancient religion had some sort of mind-altering drug, either for the priest or for the people as a whole. But there was almost always some sort of mind-altering drug in not 100% of societies, but a lot of societies. It was more common than it was not. I talk about the fact that people see these serpents. And then here's the wild thing. So they see the serpent, and then they start sacrificing human beings. So one of the interesting things about human history is there's consistent human sacrifice. Everywhere you go, there's human sacrifice. I talked about that Leslie Wilson book that's called The Serpent Symbol in the Ancient Near East. And in that book, he talks about the fact that the human sacrifice and the serpent entity go together. That everywhere you see the serpent entity, everywhere you see the serpent God, you see human sacrifice. And it's an interesting and creepy parallel. But once you see it, you can't get away from it. That you see this human sacrifice spread throughout the world, serpents spread throughout the world, and then the third part of kind of that unholy trinity is the use of drugs for spiritual purposes spread throughout the world. And if you ask the question of like, okay, they were seeing serpents, they were sacrificing to the serpents, were the serpents the result of drugs? I kind of make the implication that they probably were. As a matter of fact, that's what the Spanish said when they observed the Aztecs taking mushrooms. They said they would see serpents, they would see entities, and then they would become violent. So if you take those kind of 3 points together, the sacrifice, the serpent, and the drugs for spiritual purposes, you get kind of this dark triad that you see over and over and over again in history. And then the question is, so if these entities are real, right? So go back to what we were just talking about, if the Johns Hopkins study is true, if we can trust people when they say they see these entities, what happens when societies start to kind of go on hyperdrive and start taking these drugs over and over again as part of their religion, as part of their society? If it becomes what they are, what happens? Well, we see what happens in history. We see over and over again people start doing weird, creepy, terrible stuff, and sometimes the darkest imaginable stuff. And you have people like Graham Hancock goes on Joe Rogan, and Graham Hancock says to Joe Rogan something along the lines of, hey, if only we could get all our politicians to do ayahuasca, then we'd have a much more enlightened society. And I remember him saying that and me thinking, we have had that. The Aztecs did ayahuasca, and then they sacrificed human beings at an industrial scale, right? They ripped the hearts out of living people. Like the false lie that's been given about psychedelics in society is this idea that psychedelics will bring enlightenment. That's the promise that Joe Rogan talks about. That's the promise that all the people we've talked about, Graham Hancock and Terence McKenna and R. Gordon Wasson, over and over again, the promise is enlightenment if you do these psychedelics. But in reality, the opposite happens over and over again in history, is you see the darkest of darkest, darkening, not enlightening at all, darkening, that happens throughout the societies that do these drugs for spiritual purposes. And it happens as a matter of course. And so that's what chapter 5 talks about. Chapter 6, I then touch on the fact that there is one major society that has not done drugs for spiritual purposes, has not made it a part of their religion or part of their culture, and that is the Christian religion. And it is actually one of the biggest changes that Christianity made to the world. We never even talk about it. One of the biggest changes was that Christianity made it so that drugs were taboo, that people didn't do psychedelic drugs. And as a result, you have a very different experience in the world. And Christians over and over again say, from the earliest days, they say, we're not going to accept the use of drugs for spiritual purposes. And chapter 7 really talks about that in depth. It talks about the fact that the Bible was written in, the New Testament was written in Greek, the Old Testament was written in Hebrew, but the oldest versions of the Old Testament actually were also written in Greek. So what the New Testament writers quote when they quote the Old Testament, they quote the Greek translation of the Old Testament. So the oldest Bible we have is all in Greek. And that, if you take just like an English Bible and you search for the word drug, you can't find it. But if you take a Greek Bible and you search for the word drug, it's all over the place. And that's because the Greek word for drug is pharmakia, that is translated in English, typically translated witchcraft or sorcery. And the reason that the translation is the same for those two is because they were tied together. Just like I was saying, in ancient religions, pagan religions, drugs and sorcery, drugs and witchcraft go together so much that the Greeks had one word for both, right? It was pharmakia. And I look at the various lexicons in the book. The Freeburg lexicon, for example, says pharmakia is one who prepares and uses drugs for magical purposes or ritual witchcraft, sorcerer, poisoner, or magician. Launita lexicon says the use of drugs for any kind of magical effect or sorcery. Liddell Scott defines pharmakia as the use of drugs, potions, spells. So the reason that Christianity rejected the use of drugs for spiritual purposes out of the gate is because there's strong biblical prohibitions. So if you take that word pharmakia and then you go throughout the Old and New Testament, you get verses like Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 10 that says, "Let no one be found among you who sacrifices his son or daughter in the fire, who practices divination or sorcery, interprets omens, or engages in pharmakos," which is just a different conjugation of the word pharmakia. So it says, "Let no one be found among you that sacrifices your kids in the fire or that does pharmakia," drugs for spiritual purposes. Exodus chapter 22 says, verse 18 says, "Do not allow the one that practices drugs for spiritual purposes to live." If you look at 2 Chronicles chapter 33, verse 6, it says, talking about the evil king Manasseh, and it says, "He sacrificed his sons in the fire of the valley of Ben Hinnom, and practiced sorcery, divination, and pharmakia, and consulted mediums and spiritualists." So here again, you have there's these weird parallels throughout the Bible of human sacrifice, pharmakia. Human sacrifice, pharmakia. Don't do those two things. And it just gets repeated over and over again. So the warnings in the Bible are almost unhinged about pharmakia. And as a result, Christendom didn't have pharmakia. That got carried over. The bishops refused to allow pharmakia, and throughout the history of the church, pharmakia was banned. Even Pope Innocent VII, I believe, in the 15th century, banned even cannabis because he said it was associated with witchcraft. So this practice of pharmakia was banned within Christianity. And as a result, I think there's some pretty stark differences when we look at when the Christians showed up and saw what the Aztecs were doing with sacrifice. They were horrified. But when the Aztecs and, say, the Maya, or the Aztecs and the Inca saw what each other were doing, they wouldn't have been horrified. And as a matter of fact, in the ancient Near East, outside of kind of the Hebrew world, the Carthaginians, for example, Hannibal, who almost took over the Roman Empire, they practiced human sacrifice. The Vikings practiced human sacrifice. The Gauls practiced human sacrifice. So very few people would have been horrified by what the Aztecs were doing. But when the Spanish showed up, they were like, what the hell is going on? Like, we need to stop this. And so I make the case that there was more than just human sacrifice. There was also a lack of pharmakia on the part of the Spanish when they showed up. And I argue maybe those things are related. And now I don't want to go too far. I don't want to say everybody that does DMT is going to start sacrificing people or whatever. I don't believe that at all, and I know that's not true. I know people that have done it, so in no way is that the case I'm making. But what I do say is that let's go back to the premise. Are we really experiencing real things? Are we really interacting with real entities? Are these atheists that tell us they're interacting with real entities, are they, if that's true, if they really are, then the next question has to be, who are the entities? Are they good? Are they bad? Are they helpful? Joe Rogan says they're helpful. They say they helped him learn about his life. Or are they not good? And that's really the question we all need to be asking, because it's one thing to have this hypothetical conversation, or like, are they real? Are they not real? Should we do, what are the effects of drugs, etc. But if they are real, it's like we're bumping into an alien colony, and we need to ask, are those aliens good or bad, right? Are they is this other alien entity, this other dimension, even if you take it as a purely atheist thing, let's say we're somehow interacting with the entities in another dimension, are they good or bad? And that's the question that we need to ask. And if you take that in light of the fact that every culture that has used these drugs has gone down very dark paths, incredibly dark paths with these drugs, and has seen these serpent entities and then has committed the most horrific acts that you could imagine, I think at least we have to be skeptical. At least we have to question whether the very superficial advice they give us of like, hey, love everybody, whether they're being genuine with that. Like if you take them seriously, if you take them as possibly real entities, I think we, at a very minimum, we have to be skeptical of taking their advice. And that's the scary thing, is you have people doing these drugs and then taking their advice. Joe Rogan says that, like, that's what he says. Graham Hancock says that. He says that Mother Ayahuasca comes to him and gives him wisdom. Mother Ayahuasca, by the way, for him, is a serpent-human hybrid. That's what she is. So, and he says that she gives him advice. And so I think we have to be incredibly skeptical of what's going on and what those are. And I think a lot of people are just kind of sleepwalking into it, and they're saying, oh, I took this drug and this angel appeared to me and gave me this advice, and I'm going to now change my life based on that advice. And I think whether that's a smart move or a bad move depends on whether that angel you saw is a good angel or a weird demon from another dimension, right? So, like, I think there's a big question mark there. So,
Okay. Lewis, we're wrapping up soon. I want to ask you again. First off, thank you for being on the podcast, and thanks for like sharing your book with us. It's been really enjoyable. Is there any other research or any other things you'd want to share to our audience, like recommendations, like what they should check out getting into this subject?
Yeah, so I have just a ton of stuff I've written on this on my website, on my Substack, which again is just lewisungit.substack.com. So I've got lots of articles, lots of chapters I did not include in the book that are up there that go into a lot of this in much more depth. I have a whole article talking about what the Spanish saw when they showed up, graphics of what the there's drawings the Spanish drew of the Aztecs eating a mushroom and having like a weird lizard demon guy behind him with his hand over his head. So it's crazy stuff, very interesting. So yeah, check out my Substack, and that's probably the best way to follow the work that I'm doing. And read the book. Like I said, it's got all the citations in there. So if you're curious of like, did this guy actually read the studies, or did this guy, cite what he's looked at? It's got everything in there. You can go and you can look it all up yourself. It's fascinating. Read the Johns Hopkins study yourself. It's very worthwhile, kind of interesting just to read as a study. So yeah, that's pretty much all I have. Thanks so much for having me on.
One thing before you go, yeah, and of course you're always welcome on our show. Are you working on any other books after this, or any more studies besides your Substack, like standalones?
So I am working on another book. It's kind of a different subject, though. I'm writing on artificial intelligence, technology, and science, and looking at it from a similar perspective of like, is there? I think there's in some ways parallels to that and kind of the religious world. There's a book called Technosis that I'm reading right now that draws a lot of those parallels together from an atheistic perspective, and I want to kind of look at that from a similar perspective that I looked at this book. So I'm working on that. I hope to have that out in the next year or so, but I am posting stuff on that with on my website, so people can check that out as well.
All right, thank you very much. Hazy, is there any other last minute things you want to say?
No, I think I've had a really interesting time discussing this topic. I think if people really, I think they should really check out your Substack. I think, especially with just the small amount I perused, I really like your way of structuring in your writing. So yeah, I think there's a really good positive, and I highly recommend it.
Hey, thanks so much for that, Hazy. And I do have, I'm doing a free Kindle giveaway this Saturday. I don't know when the show's gonna play, but Saturday the 25th. I'm gonna have free Kindle. So anybody that wants to check out the book but doesn't want to spend money on it, get a free copy on Saturday.
Oh, okay. Thanks for letting me know about that.
Hey, Lewis, one last thing. Do you have a physical copy of your book as well?
I do. Yeah, you can get those on Kindle, but I'd be happy to send you a copy for free if you'd like.
I was going to ask if I could get a signed copy. So when you blow up,
you got it, man.
I appreciate it, Lewis. All right. Yeah. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
No, that's all I had. Thanks again for having me on.
Yeah, and this has been Reckon Radio. Thank you for tuning in. This is last bit from Sola. And Hazy, if you want to say anything before we close out.
And as always, you've seen us all in HD.